Welcome, everybody. My name is Shaleen Wadhwana, and I have had a gracious set of co-panelists, which is Kevin, Meera, and Akash. And we thought that we would try to rejig a bit of our introduction of the topic in and of itself through a project that I had done. We've spent about the last month and a half speaking with each other about more than 3 times. We've learned a lot about each other, but more than that, we've kind of created a rhythm and a camaraderie. We thought one of the ways in which we would like to introduce that to all of you all is through the format of the panel like this. So first, I would talk a little bit about the project that I have done, which introduces how access and outreach are reimagined in spaces of archives and museums today. After that, I would introduce Kevin, who would go on and give a presentation about the project that he's been involved in. The same would happen with Meera and with Akash as well. After that is done, we've actually prepared a set of cross-referenced questions that we've discussed and we found as common entry points into each other's projects. And those are the ones that I would be asking them. So that's how we've divided our panel today, and we hope that this format is something interesting, and if there's anything that goes wrong, that's all on me. Okay. I wanted to actually talk about the Unfiltered History Tour, which is a project that took place across more than 15 countries. It was commissioned by Vice World News UK, and this was given as a project to Dentsu Web Chutney in Bangalore. I was hired literally as an accuracy historian because my area of expertise is mid-19th century cultural repatriative laws and nuances around objects that have been looted throughout British Empire and their colonies. So I seemed to be the perfect person for the job. I did not realize what the job was until I was onboarded onto the project. Neither did I realize the access and the outreach of what that project would be. So this is kind of what I was involved in. As a cultural researcher for the project, my main job was to work with the technologists and the art directors, 2 fields I have zero idea about. What I was doing was I was working with the teams to come up with 3 frames, which means that what were the 3 moments that we can show in an augmented reality filter on Instagram when someone is now physically viewing these 10 objects at the British Museum. Now when they see it, they scan the object, they actually see the story and the historical truth of how it was looted from the country of origin. How did that action actually take place? And it is narrated with the voice of historians and activists from the countries of origin itself. If you can see, these were the countries that I was researching for. On the right-hand side, you can see an updated frame, which means it looks a lot like this. My job was to also understand the historical nuance of the time. What are the tools like? What are the weapons like? It was to look at the dress, the aura. It was to look at the trade and transport nuances of the time. This actually becomes part of now what you see as this. So if I can have the first, no, sorry, you're right. It looks a lot like this. So basically, when you enter the Unfiltered History Tour, it asks you if you're at the British Museum. Basis your answer, it takes you to a certain format. So if you say that you are, it actually takes you to a guided tour within the museum to these 10 objects, and you can actually scan your phone and see that. But if you aren't, which is where we are right now, we have this experience. We scroll down and we look at a YouTube video which talks about the same content. We actually go into an immersive audio museum guide, which are in the format of podcasts, something you will be hearing with all my co-panelists a lot today, the format of podcasts and why it's important. A 1-minute clip about the same. So that's the first video. Thank you.
There were 2 foreign powers in rivalry over Egypt. One of them won over the other, and they took the war spoils of the other. It has never left Egypt legally. It's a war spoil. It's a trophy of empire. The Rosetta Stone was not the discovery neither of the French, neither of the British. It was already discovered and reused in Egypt multiple times. And I think up till today, this is the symbolism of who owns the Rosetta Stone today. It's the British Museum. And the Rosetta Stone is not only the property of the British Museum, but it's part of British history. The Rosetta Stone became part of the British brand. Colonialism has never gone away. Maybe there aren't British troops in Egypt, but there is still this influence. There is this colonialism of knowledge.
You can go back to the PPT, please. Thank you. One of the ways to measure access, outreach, is to look at the statistics of what any project that we've ever encountered and that we've been part of, what does it actually do? The advantage of all my co-panelists here is that they are in the process of making their projects, so you will have such statistics soon. But in case of this one, it was an 18-month-long effort. There were more than 100 team members across 15 countries. But up until 2022, what we learned was that there were 18 million social impressions. More than 100,000 people in Britain used the tour. That was the square feet of the British Museum that we had utilized in research. There are 31,000 podcast downloads, 55,000 website visits. Now, what all this culminates into is something like this, which is again a 2-minuter. I urge everyone, that's the second film. I urge everyone to concentrate on the second half of the 2 minutes, because that was the true impact of even having something like this done.
The British Museum is a public institution dedicated to human history, art and culture. Come discover over 80,000 works from around the world, here in London. You are now viewing the Guigal Shield. Captain James Cook was a British event.
We're now looking at the Guigal Shield, which was taken from my people.
Collections in the British museums are premised on a simple idea. I'm proud of what my grandfather stole from yours.
The Rosetta Stone was not the discovery neither of the French, neither of the British. It was already discovered and reused in Egypt multiple times.
For us, it's not just a well-carved rock, it is a living ancestor.
This very important statue is on display in a museum thousands of miles away.
Say the British Museum is the world's largest receiver of stolen goods. We're launching an interactive tour of some of its most contested artifacts.
There is always a story behind every object that was made in the kingdom, and that is how we told our history.
There were two foreign powers in rivalry over Egypt. One of them won over the other, and they took the war spoils of the other.
I feel I've received a balanced narrative.
For many Assyrians, it was maybe the last time we could really stand up to people who were trying to bully us.
We sort of went around the world and took what we wanted, and it makes me feel a deep level of shame.
Museums around Europe are slowly realizing that exhibiting items taken by force hundreds of years ago from other countries is kind of gross. And it's about time. We can't change the past, but we can change how we engage with it in the present.
Thank you so much. This is one aspect of impact, where this tour, which was part of such a huge contingent of people that were involved in making this happen. This tour won 12 awards for India at the Cannes Lions Festival, which is the first time India has won that many awards, and the first time an APAC country has won that level of awards. One is seeing impact and outreach towards reimagined access in this format, but the one that really made me very, very proud was this one. The reason this project was launched was because a lot of British students and young adults felt that the British Empire was unequivocally an amazing thing to have happened in British history, and had next to zero idea about the kind of damages that the British Empire had wielded on most of its colonies. After the tour was released, there was a significant change in public polling in terms of how young Britons thought about this part of their history. And this is kind of what it looked like. Since then, repatriation efforts when it comes to Britain have increased when it comes to former colonies. Now, this is what a finished project looks like. I think we have the distinct advantage in this panel, the fact that there are my co-panelists that are working on different aspects of reimagining museum spaces and existing archives within those museum spaces, and making sure that the reimagined access is something that culminates in multiple results of energizing the heritage consciousness within our own country about our own history and heritage. This, in the end, is still a foreign project committed by, commissioned by Vice World News in UK. So for me, this was an introduction to what reimagined access right now, which is being seen as the state of the art, looks like. But now we kind of move on to my co-panelists over here. I would take this moment to introduce Kevin Fernandez. He is extremely meticulous, so let me start with that. Very, very meticulous, very patient, very consistent. He is a researcher and currently an assistant professor of English at the Indian Institute of Psychology and Research in Bangalore. He is collaborating with project coordinator Anirudh Kanisetti, working with the Museum of Christian Art, MoCA, Goa, for the foundation project implemented by IFA. I give this over to Kevin, and you will be enthralled.
Check. All right, good morning, everyone. Let me start by placing on record my gratitude to the IFA and MoCA for a beautiful year of support, and more than support, I'd say friendship. The friendship and warmth I've received from both these organizations has been phenomenal, and it's something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I'm also humbled to be in a space where so many people believe in art and beauty, because I sincerely believe that art and beauty will save the world. There's nothing else left to save us. And I'm also humbled to speak about the intersection of faith, art, and power on what is a very important day for Konkani Christians, the feast of Saint Francis Xavier, a very controversial poster boy for us. So this is the project that we've been working on for the last 1 year. It's titled I'm so sorry. Okay, it's titled The Altars of Time, A History of Goa Through Its Christian Art. I'm working together with Anirudh Kanisetti on this particular project. So the idea behind this project was, as Indra mentioned yesterday, there's a tendency for us to see museums and archives as dusty storehouses of history. And we forget that all of these things that are part of these museum spaces are actually lived objects. They're objects that people touched, people used, people had emotional connections to. And so we wanted to break that narrative, or we wanted to actually humanize these objects. And we wanted to do it through podcasts. We wanted to take the museum out of the museum space and into people's homes, right? I come from Bangalore, where people are always trying to do something different, right? Trying to one-up the other. And podcasts are a huge thing in Bangalore. People are always talking about the podcast they're listening to. There used to be a time when people used to talk about the books they read, but now it's the podcast they listen to. So people are doing them at home, on their commute. Bangalore is famous for its traffic. And if you're like me, while you're washing the dishes. So we wanted to take the museum to all of these spaces where people live and do the things that they normally do. We also hope at some point it could lend itself to being a kind of curatorial tool, which already exists in many museum spaces in the form of audio guides. And it's also inspired by a history of the world in 100 objects. Why a podcast? As I mentioned earlier, it is a very popular form. Unlike a lot of other podcasts which are conversational, our podcasts are narrative. They focus on one person telling the story of an object. And of course, Anirudh, who works with me, is a very successful podcast superstar from Echoes of India and Yuddha, which have come on a number of lists. Another fascinating thing with podcasts, which we realize as we work with it, is that, unlike a lot of other forms, let's say like exhibitions or printed publications, a podcast has a very long afterlife. Right? It's always just there, available in the public domain. Anyone, anywhere can tap into it at any time and share it, right? And therefore, it leaves space for organic growth. And the final reason is the pandemic itself. The pandemic is something that motivated us to apply and take up this particular project. And the pandemic also prevented us from actually doing a lot of, groundwork. So a lot of our work was with digital archives and things like that. And it made sense in the pandemic situation to work on an oral form. So this is our project site, the Museum of Christian Art. Many of you would be familiar with the image on this side, which is the Augustinian ruins on Holy Hill. Just beside it, there is a beautiful building which has these flying buttresses that often escapes people's eyes. This is the convent of Santa Monica, and the Museum of Christian Art is located in that particular convent. This is the view from inside the convent. Now this is inside the museum, and it's a very, very fascinating museum. I cannot stop talking about how fascinated I am by this space. It used to be an enclosed convent. In Catholicism, there is the idea of enclosure. Women take vows of stability when they become nuns, and once they take the vow of enclosure, they never leave the enclosure till death. They're also partitioned from the public, so the public is not allowed to see them, which is why in this first image you will see these grills. The nuns used to sit on this side of the chapel for their prayer, the choir section. Now, very interestingly, from a space which was hidden from the public eye, a space that was meant to be private, it turned into a museum. Over a period of 100 years, it's passed many hands and it has served many different purposes. Currently, it is a museum, right? And this becomes a space where the whole world looks into the universe of Christian art. And I thought that a reversal of the gaze was very fascinating in this space. Another very fascinating thing about the museum is it lets you see things up close and personal, which you can see in this little image here. It's a detail from an image that we all saw yesterday. It was part of Mario's display. It was Salvador Mundi, infant Jesus on the globe. And this is a little carving from that particular image, right, which you wouldn't ordinarily see if you saw this image in a church. Okay, so we wanted to give life to these objects, to tell their stories. Because these are also objects from a space of worship, we may not necessarily know who commissioned them and in which year. But in the museum metadata, there is enough information to tell us where these objects came from, who donated them to the museum. And therefore, when we do not know the story of the object, the next thing that we turn to is, what is this object used for? Right? These are all liturgical objects, so you can see those images there. They're cruets. They're placed on the altar. They would be seen only by priests and altar boys. Right? And today now they're in the museum. Everyone can see the amount of detail and effort that goes into making these two liturgical objects. So our episodes either tell stories of the objects themselves, they tell stories of the craftsmanship or the kind of form that is used to make, the kind of techniques used to make these objects. They also tell stories of what these objects represent within the theological universe of Christianity. Again, this is another detail. The monstrance is in the museum, and that's a tiny little flower which caught my attention when I was looking at this monstrance in the museum, right? And as a practicing Catholic, I've never seen a monstrance up close and personal till I came to the museum. One of my personal favorites, Saint Sebastian, is also a favorite in art history circles because he died a very old man of clubbing. But in Christianity, we always represent him as a young, virile man stretched out. Throughout my entire childhood, I've always seen him from a distance on the walls of churches and chapels. And when I was in the museum, I could actually count his ribs. It was such a different, intimate experience of perhaps faith. So what happens in our podcast? We're making 25 episodes. Each episode focuses on one object, approximately 15 minutes, and a total of 6 hours worth of content. And like I said, each episode will talk about the history of Goa, the craftsmanship, the aesthetics, the lived social experience. Right? What was this object used for in the church? How we did this? We made a long list and then a short list. And a very interesting problem that we encountered was how do we order these episodes, right? How do we structure this entire podcast? And there were some obvious choices: the period in which these objects were made, or the materials in which were used to make these objects, or the way the objects are displayed in the museum. And with all of these choices, what came back was the fact that we would be clubbing together very similar objects and would become very boring and repetitive to a listener. And then finally, while one day when we were having a conversation about the beauty of the Santa Monica space, we suddenly realized that if we're telling the story of Christianity and Christian art, we should do it the way the believer does, which is the experience of walking through the church. What is the first object you would encounter when you open the door of the church, while you walk up the pew, when you climb up to the altar? And that is the way in which we have structured the podcast, the different episodes within the podcast. And material comes from the catalog, the metadata of the museum, online resources made available to us, and a couple of interviews as well. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about our process. There's one very fascinating thing that happens here. So I write as an insider. The episodes begin with me. I structure the episodes. I talk about the object, how it's used, and the theology and biblical references that are used based on which the object is created. And then I send it to Anirudh. And then Anirudh writes back to me and says, I don't understand any of this. Right? Because as an insider, I just, use ideas, use dogmas, use scripture without necessarily thinking that there may be people who don't understand this, right? I also come from an academic space, so my sentences are longer and convoluted, right? Because if I can't make sense, the least I can do is try and confuse you. So what Anirudh does is he changes it from the language of writing to the language of listening, right? And that's a crucial part of even my learning process working on this project. And then of course we send it to Mocha, which very graciously gives us their time, goes through the script, and then comes back to us with feedback. Sometimes it's factual, sometimes it's idea-wise, and we work on that. And then finally the episode is sent for recording, and then we're building up our collection, and it'll be released on the 21st of January. So these are some images of us behind the scene. I'll come back to this particular image and why I put this here later on when we have our conversation. So the backing track of the podcast was recorded live in Bangalore in St. Andrew's Church. The Bangalore Men and the very beautiful and iconic pipe organ of Bangalore Church is featured in our podcast. Okay, this is one of my favorite stories about this podcast, and I'm so sorry I've already overstepped time, but I will tell the story and go. So this object here is a very beautiful object called a thurubal. A thurubal is very central to Catholic worship. It exists primarily in Catholic forms of worship, and it's used to offer incense. Now, the thurubal makes a very, very beautiful sound. It is the sound of the body of the object hitting against the chain, and it's always done in threes, so it's done thrice. We wanted to include the sound of a thurubal as part of the soundscape for the project, but we couldn't find any recordings of the sound on the internet. We searched for videos of church services, and even there the audio of this particular sound was not very clear. Also, this happens at the most dramatic and significant moments of a service. So therefore, it becomes impossible for us to record it while a service is going on. And we spent a lot of time, I was hell-bent on having the sound of the thurubal as part of the episode, and we didn't know what to do, and then I gave up on the idea, and our sound engineer very intelligently discovered this scene from Eyes Shut Wide, right? And this is seconds before the characters in this scene get into an orgy. So there isn't a man blowing incense, right? So he watched this scene, he studied the sound of the thurubal there, and then recreated it using a dog chain and a utensil from his house, right? So when you listen to our podcast eventually, the sound that you will hear in that particular episode is not the sound of an actual thurubal. And this asks very important questions about production of space. When we're moving from a physical space to an oral space, how do we recreate that space? There are certain sounds we associate, audiotopes, right, that we associate with that particular space, and we're trying to recreate that in a soundscape. And then, it also opens up questions of authenticity. Right? Am I authentically recreating? Can I authentically recreate this particular space? Right? Because we clearly saw the authentic recreation is not going to work. Right? And when I take an alien object and use it to make the same sound, I'm able to get that particular space. Right? So the production of space really depends on the perception of space more than the actual space itself. Yeah, and this is how our project will end. It will end with our deliverables on the 21st of Jan. MOCA will celebrate its 30th anniversary. Yeah, 29th anniversary. And our podcast will be released then. It's been exciting so far, and looking forward to continuing to grow with MOCA and hopefully with IFA as well. Thank you all so much. Altars of Time, ma'am. Not yet, ma'am. It will be released on the 21st of Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I had pretty much the same question. Is it already there? When is it going to get there? Okay. I'm now introducing Meera Krishnamurthy. She makes animation films with handmade puppets, cutouts, and stop-motion animation. Her films have been screened at Anima Fest Zagreb and Dubai Expo 2020. She is the project coordinator working with the SL Bhatia History of Medicine Museum, Library and Archives, Bangalore, for the foundation project implemented by IFA. In the time that we've had a rich set of discussions, we kind of coalesce because there are two of my co-panelists that intersect at the same site. So imagine the kind of vantage points we, gleaned from both of them. So one of them is Meera, and I give this over to her.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining us on a Saturday. I would like to begin by extending my thanks to IFA and SL Bhatia Museum for giving me this opportunity. I was surprised, but nevertheless thankful. Also, I thank Radhika, Ritvika, and Shaleen for support that I've got this year. 6 months, but still. Okay, so this, it's an animated typewriter, so you can actually see it like a ghost typewriter typing away, which is not playing, but can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the project vision was to make short animated pieces that bring to life some of the objects and archives at the SL Bhatia Museum imaginatively. These will be played on iPads around the museum. A little bit about the project site. SL Bhatia Museum is housed deep inside St. John's Institute. So unless you know of its location, it's very hard to come by. And John's is known for its hospital, its medical college, and even its deer park, but not so much for its history of medicine museum, unfortunately. So our project aims to create an audiovisual experience and capture new audiences through this. And this we intend to do through animated exhibits, public engagement programs, and virtual presence through the year. The project tries to be visitor-centered by including Bengaluru city in its visual and contextual details, thus fostering a sense of belonging and relationship with the museum for the local community. Got it. So I approach it by examining how animation has been used as a tool to entertain and educate in museums worldwide. 3 works were analyzed mainly. The first one's called Cut, which curated 40 animation films at the old Operating Theatre Museum in London. So this project tried to bring the sense of the people that once worked there or who were treated in that space, which is now filled with glass cases and curious objects. The second work that I analyzed is Shadow Stories by Dr. Samantha Moore, which animated 18 objects from the Shrewsbury Museum's prehistoric gallery and weaved them into stories. So this project shows how the objects were used and their significance. The third one was my favorite one, is the most interesting one, is The Phantom at the Museum. It's a stop-motion animation created by brothers Quay around the bizarre medical objects that belonged to Sir Henry Wellcome. So this film proved what we all sort of suspect, that objects are indeed more interesting at night and after we've left the gallery. Having studied this, I learned that animation is more than a technical form of filmmaking. It's an interesting way to bring people to the museum. So animation is a visceral medium that requires no language. It has a flexibility to communicate scientific and historical concepts through visuals and symbols. So according to a study conducted by Microsoft in 2015, the human attention span has markedly decreased to 8 seconds, 8.25 seconds, and it's definitely lesser in 2022. So the project aims to capture new audience by cutting through text-heavy material and making through audiovisual experience. As you can see, this is the Women in Medicine section at the S.L. Bhatia Museum. It's quite text-heavy and it is static. Now, even though the term animation is used synonymously with kids' entertainment, it is popular with adults alike in the form of movies, TV shows, and video games. So even if animation is not the primary focus at exhibitions, it can be used in museum education and outreach programs. In a museum space, animation can create broken and fragile objects. It can understand the evolution of an object, speculate how objects were used, simulate scientific content, restore old photographs, and most importantly, tell stories. So at S.L. Bhatia Museum, we wanted to bring people to the museum by giving them the context. So what is the story behind this one-of-a-kind history of medicine museum? Who was Major General Bhatia and what is his connection to the city of Bangalore? To answer that, I'm creating a documentary on the life of S.L. Bhatia. S.L. Bhatia is a surgeon and an administrator who provided medical aid in 2 world wars. He is also the first Indian dean at Grant Medical College in Bombay and its associated Sir J.J. Group of hospitals. It was his greatest goal to offer history of medicine as a course in medical colleges, and he did just that at St. John's. So the research for this involved excavating a lot of boxes, pouring through Major General's photos, letters, archives, any writings we could find, and secondary research sources were also studied, like academic papers and some books written on S.L. Bhatia, which are available only at the museum. A visual research was done to see Bhatia's influence on the global audience. So the script attempts to capture the personal as much as it does the professional. As a collection in the museum, so when I started doing the storyboard, storyboard is nothing but it's a visual plotting of the film. So I had to decide on what medium would I do this in. And since the collection at the museum began with Major General's collection in the form of his bag, his stethoscope, his books, and some paintings that he's donated at the museum, it felt quite organic to tell his life story through his items. So this film features a mix of object animation as well as photos. The film is currently in production. Can we have the first video, please? Yeah. This is it. So something like that. Can we have the second one also, please? Yeah. So in 1954, Bhatia was the chairman of the Pharmaceutical Inquiry Committee, and his team encouraged the public and private sectors to produce their own vaccines and antibiotics, thus making India largely sufficient. So can we just have it again, because it was too fast. So each of this object was done separately, so it took a lot of time, and it was done in 2 different angles. So first you would animate one object, and then we would do this for 18 more objects, and then we would capture another angle. So it takes a lot of time, but it's a lot of fun. So yeah, sorry. No, the next. Yeah, got it. Besides SL Bhatia, the other area we're exploring at the museum is the Women in Medicine section. This has led to building the archives and expanding this section. Thank you. This has led to building the archives and expanding this section to include hidden stories. So we found a gap in the published material that we don't know anything about the first lady medical officer of Bangalore. Who is she? What is her story? And what did Bangalore maternity look like before the 1900s? So while doing extensive research through the state archives, we came across a Rose Govindarajalu. As a Bangalorean, it was quite exciting to dig and uncover her story, and this is the only image that we found of her. This research will be developed into an exhibition in the near future at the museum. For Bangaloreans, it's significant to learn about the history of medicine in their own city of women. Perhaps new projects such as films, storytelling, screenings, and plays can be built on this research. So as a part of the IFA project, 3 public engagement programs will be developed. The first one was a hands-on stop-motion animation workshop, which was held on November 5th, 2022. We had 12 new participants, which means 12 fresh blood at the museum. The workshop, hang on. Yeah. The workshop was successful in attracting new audience for the very first time. It made them curious about the objects. It demystified medical objects and helped build empathy with them. The new and alternative perspectives, it only adds to the collection and makes it even richer. Art connects medical students and with their own creativity and communicate their work better. The participants are now stakeholders at the museum, and therefore the workshop has helped create a community space in a medical museum. These are a few stills from the workshop. The workshop began by covering through some basics of animation. Participants walked around the museum and they chose objects and weaved stories around them and animated them under a camera. And we had a screening and a discussion at the end. Can we have the video, please? So the outcome of the workshop was 6 films and a curatorial note that has been uploaded online and will be a part of the museum's archives. Can you have the last slide, please? Yeah. The outcome is 9 films made on General S.L. Bhatia that will be played on, that highlights different phases of his life and will be played on iPads around the museum. A trailer, a poster and stills of the film will be uploaded on social media. Following a screening at the museum, the film will be played at film festivals, public places like library and school, to raise awareness about the film. The work will be uploaded on Google Arts and Culture for people not living in Bengaluru and want to access the project. The 3 public engagement programs are the hands-on animation workshop on November 5th, the exhibition on women in medicine, and a screening of a film followed by a Q&A that will mostly happen in March. For the museum, the project is an attempt to make the space multisensorial. Perhaps it will lead to more animation films or more creative projects based on engagement with the archives. And this project might be useful to view the role of animation in museums in the future. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you so much. I think you had us agog with the kind of talent you've unearthed from a one-day animation workshop. I'm now introducing Akash Srinivas. He is a prehistoric archaeologist and currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Ashoka University, Haryana. He engages in public archaeology on the forum Chai with History and the podcast Chip in Away, which is also incidentally his Instagram handle.
Thank you.
He is the project coordinator working with the S.L. Bhatia History of Medicine Museum, Library and Archives, Bangalore, for the foundation project implemented by IFA. So I give this over to him and take it forward.
Thank you so much. So I think I'd like to thank Kevin and Meera for setting up the context, both with regards to podcasts as a means of both communication and entertainment, or edutainment as people like to say it, as well as Meera for setting up the stage for the site. As Shaleen also mentioned, these are projects that are still active and in production, so it's not yet titled. So let's see where these discussions and conversations go before we jump into that. So the objective of the project is to create or rather use the various resources that are in the museum, the library, archives, and as an archaeologist, the museum and the material culture itself becomes an archive for me. So we enjoy and have discussions with the elements, conversations with these instruments and objects, and try to tell their stories as well. And through that we want to develop a whole bunch of caricatures, web blogs, gallery activities to engage both digital and physical in-person audiences. So the approach of this project is multifold. It starts with research. The crux of the entire project is research using the various archives available at the museum, and then through that develop the podcast, a bunch of exhibition activities, educational activities to get in people as well as digital audiences, and finally public outreach and engagement. Let's jump into them individually. So the research focus is primarily a literature review based on what is in the library, the archives, as well as various other miscellaneous sources of information based on work that is being done by us and others simultaneously. There's going to be interviews of the museum staff as well as experts in these different fields. And finally, we draw from our own research. As an archaeologist, I've looked at physical remains of people from the past, so looking at disease in human bodies, various surgical practices that we see in the past, those elements, and plus my co-host, she looks at deities of disease, traditional folk medicine as an anthropologist, and plus when we are doing research for this, as a researcher, you dive down various rabbit holes, end up in places which are not directly related to the work you're doing, and I think one of that was Rose Govindarajulu. So when we are looking at the stuff that is in the museum and the archives, we kept coming across this name of Rose Govindarajulu, and then we started digging into her. We found out she was from the first batch of people who passed out from Madras Christian College in terms of medicine in 1885. Then she got a scholarship to go to Scotland and Ireland to learn various medical practices, to come back, and was employed by the royal family, the Mysore royal family, to develop maternal health and medicine in Mysore. And these are things that we're currently working on, and hopefully in March we'll have more things, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. So from this, we're getting the podcast that comes out from this research. There's 12 episodes of about 20 minutes each, and as Kevin said, we in Bangalore try to one-up each other. So instead of just looking at the elements, we're looking at the themes that are discussed in the museum. So the museum covers different themes, and drawing from these, we are drawing these different episodes to try and get people interested in the concept and the theme itself, so they can come to the museum to look at how it is there and what are the elements that it included. So this includes an introduction to the museum and the man behind the collection in the museum, plus situating the space within Bangalore city. Why and how institutions, medical institutions in Bangalore grew and developed, the role of philanthropy, the role of the royal family, and all of these issues, especially even the growth of the city itself, and how the plague governed how it moved and grew. Plus, we're looking at various thematical themes that are covered in the podcast, sorry, in the museum, to look at, traditional medicine, women in early medicine, the art of illustrations, and how they and medical and how our understanding of the human body grew from prehistoric times into the present. And also looking at various other collaborations with Meera, with Radhika, and other people who worked in the museum. So as a highlight, last year for International Museum Day, we featured the museum, and it was well received. I think a lot of the people in the IFA came across the episode, and we got good reviews. So that helped us, try and direct how we want to move forward with the rest of the production series. So the exhibit element includes various artistic caricatures that are developed from the different episodes and the research, in order to, simplify the heavy themes of medical history, to make it more accessible to the public and the non-specialist. Further, we're going to have blog posts curated both by the experts and by ourselves based on the research, and upload it onto the website to engage digital audiences. And finally, to make, like I said, this is going to be all launched in March along with the other projects that we have in line. Then the educational activities include various gallery activities to engage the public and the physical audiences that come to the museum. So these are going to include puzzles, discovery box, and match the following, so that the audiences can engage with the collections without supervision. This is being done in collaboration with the museologist, and it's going to be cost and resource effective, because this is a small museum within a larger institution which is generally invisible, and the curator also doubles up as so many other things, so they can't always be present. So in this case, these do-it-yourself activities make these physical visitors to the museum stakeholders in the whole process and their engagement with the museum. The public outreach and engagement activities is again to draw in more audiences to this place and make this space more visible in the museum map of Bangalore and generally in the sphere of Bangalore socio-cultural activities. So one of those includes, from drawing from my own work, the scopes and contributions of the archaeological record and skeletal remains in it, curated museum tours and walks, then the group discussion, which are looking at women doctors and physical and medical practitioners, and finally an audio guide to make it more accessible to the public. So these are just insights into the work that we've carried on so far. So me giving a tour and me giving a talk, and me giving another talk right here about giving a talk about a tour. Then the project outcomes and deliverables at this stage include the primary podcast, which is going to be 12 episodes long. Then curated blog posts discussing the various themes with references so people can follow up on their own. So when people say they want to do their research, we're giving them the means to do their own research. Artistic caricatures to engage with younger audiences, as well as a website to host it for perpetuity, or as long as we continue to pay the fees. Then there's going to be an audio guide to engage with physical visitors at the museum, gallery activities, as I detailed, and finally these public outreach activities. So this way we are engaging both digital audiences as well as physical audiences to the space. In that regard, this is the introduction to the project, and I think we'll jump into the rest of the thing.
Akash, thank you so much. It almost didn't feel as we were talking about the same site, because yours and Meera's interventions are delightfully very, very diverse, and which is how it should be. We're now going to wait for the PPT to be back on to maybe the one after that. I think it's next slide. So, thank you, basically, for a very delightful introduction into the projects that you all are involved in and are creating. You know, in our many conversations, we've always talked about the fact that how does one set up the stage for the series of conversations that we want to have, and also how do we literally set up the stage for the kind of interventions you all have to have in the spaces that you all were involved in. One of the things we discussed a lot was, in the case of Meera and Akash, for example, the hospital is a first responder to any series of crisis. It is when we get onto the arts and the writing and the memory and the archiving, that is the second response to anything that ever happens. So there's that interesting way in which the first approach to a hospital is in need, and there's a huge diverse audience that you already have access to, but whether do they access the projects that you're working in and the site that you're working on? That's one interesting aspect for us to think about a little bit. And similarly, Kevin, when it comes to you, when we think about your site, specifically, and we look at the timings in which you all have started your projects as well, a bit of physical distance due to the pandemic also has an interesting role to play into how and where were you situated within the hospital, how much access you had, how and where were you situated within the museum, and did you need to, and how often did you need to have access to the museum? So just the visibility of your spaces and your interaction with that visibility would be interesting to understand. Kevin, maybe why don't you start us off?
So I think I want to start by talking about the visibility of of MOCA. Now, I showed you images of MOCA, where it's located, and how it has to compete with the giant ruins of the Augustinian complex. But what I'm particularly proud of MOCA is the very strong presence it has in the Goan community. So for starters, MOCA has a very strong presence online, very active on social media. They also do a lot of programs. So within the space of the museum, they organize concerts, exhibitions. They've been doing walks in the locality. And they've also been organizing programs for children. But sadly, in my conversations with Natasha, who's also here and whom you'll hear later today, we discovered that these things don't necessarily translate into footfall, right? Increasing the number of people visiting the museum. And I have three possible explanations for why this is happening with this particular site. My first explanation is possibly the space of Goa itself and the tourist segment it attracts. So Goa primarily attracts relaxation/entertainment segment, and not necessarily a heritage segment. So when people think of traveling to Goa, a museum may not be high on their list of priorities. The second is the presence of the ASI Museum within walking distance from Mocha. So right outside the Bomjesu and Say Cathedral is the ASI Museum, and you have to walk some distance from there to Holy Hill, where you first see the Augustinian ruins, and then you extend your gaze and then see the convent of Santa Monica, where Mocha is located. So this physical challenge could be possibly one of the reasons why Mocha does well digitally, but not necessarily with regards to footfall, and which kind of bleeds into my third reason, the presence of the Augustinian complex, right? The Augustinian complex is free of cost, it doesn't charge entry. It makes for excellent photo shoots, and we know today we travel more through pictures than through actual experiences. So the average tourist is more likely to walk into the ruins complex, click pictures, rather than spend time engaging in the museum and the objects there. So I think these are some of the challenges that my site faces with regards to visibility.
So the Medicine Museum and the hospital, it's an unlikely space for entertainment. As a result, SL Bhatia Museum gets overlooked. So that's why through my project, I'm creating an animation film and asking Bangaloreans to come and visit the museum, giving them the context. So the film will, it'll only complement the ongoing projects at the museum, like the walkthroughs conducted by Curator Radhika Hegde and Akash's audio guides, and the public lectures that happen at the space. So I think tech is what is bringing visibility to the space in the future, in March hopefully, that through tech is
one of the tools that we have, actually. Yeah. You're quite right in mentioning and introducing technology, because how can we reimagine access and outreach without urging technology into our conversation, as you said, right?
Yeah, so basically it's encouraging people to visit the museum and to explore the depth of what the museum has to offer. So, and I think that's the main role of technology, is to spotlight the objects, make you aware of the archives and the objects, and not technology itself.
Correct. And continuing on from what Meera said, and also building on Kevin, it's the space of the museum itself. It's within a hospital, and most people who are coming to the hospital either are distressed or in need of help. And even within the hospital, the location of it is in the middle of nowhere, unfortunately. So this is, as a Bangalorean itself, until earlier in the year, I didn't know that it existed, and it's about a few kilometers from my house and college, and the times where we used to bunk and go, still we didn't know this space existed. So and this is something we'll also see later on during the conversation about how the changing nature of the space itself and the times that we're in has made this something that we have to actively push forth, and hopefully our interventions will set the stage for that.
Of course. Which leads us on to the next conversation. So one of the things that we discussed a lot actually was what it takes even to have done midway work. And though January is right around the corner and so is March, so I don't know what is midway in this, even for the work that you have done and will do, there's a certain behind the scenes which is just not visible in the final project, which is if Meera explains that, she has to shoot the medicine bottle this way and this way for it to have been made into that animation, but we're just so wowed by what we have seen. It doesn't click the amount of hours clocked in for that, or for that matter, podcasting while we enjoy Spotify. What it takes for, when you spelled out the process for us, or the methodology in your case, in both your case, that's a lot of time. That's so much time that goes into a certain research-oriented back and forth. And we always look at the final product and we love the final product, and for a lot of people, whether it is the AR filter, unfiltered history tour, it's like this nice little shiny thing that is finished. But it's 1.5 years worth of countless hours. So I think this is, to invite you all back into what it takes, what are the behind the scenes in terms of approach it in any which way, things that are not already visible and not to what you've already told us. Just start again from Kevin.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier on in my first presentation, one of the problems that we face while working with the objects in the museum is that because they are objects that are part of everyday use in their original context, there's not a lot of data about the object. So in the museum metadata, there is usually information about who donated the object, not necessarily where it was made, or who commissioned the object, where the object was sourced from, and the year or the time period. But of course, the museum team has done an excellent job of making very accurate, what should I say? I don't want to call them assumptions, but accurate readings of the objects based on conversations with similar objects in other collections, right? So that lack of data itself becomes a huge challenge when you're telling the story of an object, right? Sometimes it really feels like we're clutching at straws, right? Because we just don't know where this object was made, or where does it come, right? Where does it come from? Who made it? Was it made in India? Was it made in Sri Lanka? We have no idea. And this has, so one of the ways we overcome this is sometimes midway through the course of our production, we realize that we cannot work on one object alone in that particular episode. We have to club it with another object, maybe a similar object, or an object with which we can draw some kind of contrast. Now, from a larger project point of view, this comes with its own hiccups, because we have a list of 25 objects, 25 episodes that we need to deliver. Right? So that also essentially means that we are constantly revising this list, right, and shifting objects around in order to meet that requirement of 25 objects. And I think something that no one ever really talks about is the fact that we all have full-time jobs, and this project they're passion projects. We're doing them because we love these objects, we love these spaces, and there are so many times when we're on video calls, either with them or with Natasha and Anirudh, and then I'll be like signing in the back, telling someone like just leave it on my table or do something like that, right? In the middle of work, in the middle of all of these other things, we have to make time, and at the end of it all, it's because we love these objects, or we love these forms, or we love these spaces. So I think that's something that we don't acknowledge often enough.
Thank you, Kevin, actually, because you spoke to a reality within emerging scholars, if not established scholars in the audience, that we're wearing multiple hats, and in wearing multiple hats, it also means that you have to take out multiple chunks of time, and whether this is for financial sustainability, because we're all in the arts, capital A arts. Yeah, so when it comes to that aspect of behind the scenes, which is very well elucidated, which is the aspect of time.
Correct.
To deliver these results, and in the projects that you all have like specific deliverables and timelines, as you all have shown us so beautifully. So one other aspect of this behind the scenes that you'd like to shed some light on, please.
Speaking of multiple hats, when I was writing the script for Bhatia's film, he's lived for 90 years, and in this 90 years he was a student, he's been a surgeon at a hospital and in the armed forces, he was in 2 world wars, he's a researcher, an administrator, a teacher, a social figure, an advisor, and a writer. So he's done so much, and it was so difficult to condense this into just a few minutes. What do you pick out? It was quite challenging to write this. And the other thing is, he's often referred to as like a godlike person, So there's a book written by Dr. Sharayu Pandit, his second wife, and it's titled The Greatest Son of India. So that is how he's spoken of in superlative and as a larger than life being. So it was quite challenging to figure out how to make him more human, more likable. So generally you look for vulnerabilities, you look for fear, likes and dislikes and such. So the story and the script and the storyboard had to be tweaked so many times to arrive at a format where you can connect with his story, and it doesn't just read off like a LinkedIn page or something like that. And the technical challenges of stop motion animation was the fun part of it for me to solve, because all objects are different. You don't know how you're going to animate each object, you don't know what they're going to offer, you don't know how they're going to move. So the first object I tried to animate, I think, was the stethoscope, was a huge mistake, because although it looks so simple, it does not animate easily. I don't know what it's called, it just doesn't stay in place, and I tried to make it move around like a snake. I was just trying something out, and it is so difficult. So these are the things, you don't know what you're going to encounter unless you start working on it. So a lot of it goes unseen. A lot of this work goes unseen, and I think I spent like 3 days on that stethoscope, and like right now it's just sitting in a folder, I'm not using it right now. So but that said, I think everything at the museum is animatable, as long as I use some double-sided tape and some clay. So that's it. That's mine.
Yeah, and I think, as Kevin also pointed out, when you're making a podcast as a researcher, it's to beat in those sentences from science, from writing for a publication to writing to a digital audience. And we tackle that by having unscripted dialogues. So while Kevin had multiple revisions and making scripts, we just got on call with various resource persons. So the hunt for these resource persons in these various niche studies itself is difficult. Say for example, the history of mental institutions in colonial India, or maternal health in say southern Karnataka. So finding them, one, hunting them down, then getting access to them, and then coordinating through different time zones. So my co-host, she's currently doing her PhD in Canada. So automatically all our recording sessions are in the middle of my night. And then trying to coordinate that with the guests, and then multiple cups of coffee, you're hyperactive, you're trying to have a conversation. So all of that involves a lot of post-processing and editing work from my end. So this is something fun, but the end product is always interesting. And it's one thing that we have to see, is that when we're talking to people, we go down different avenues, and all of them are fun. We want to represent all of them, and cutting down an entire conversation of an hour into 20 minutes, we have to take these hard decisions. And yeah, that's something fun, and it pains in a bit.
Of course.
If I can just
please.
Yeah, if I can just interject, I think listening to both of you speak, I think at some point we should also talk about everything we rejected.
Oh, yeah.
I can make a film out of just the rejected material.
That itself is a fun archives, what makes the cut and what is disposed. Yeah.
We have a layer of more podcasts and layer of more films after the project is completed.
Good idea for the next project.
See? Yeah, absolutely. So far. Lucky for that.
Speaking of pain.
Pain. See, you were the cue for the next slide. This is why. We discussed this topic to death. And that is not a very good connotative sentence here. Sorry. We would be remiss to mention the fact that this is an in-person conference in another city, which may or may not be our home cities. This in and of itself as an idea was not something to be trifled with over the last couple of years. We spoke to each other a lot about, first, what did the pandemic change, if it did change anything, for these aspects of the projects, and what did the pandemic change for us as researchers that are now aiming for multiple aspects of digital audiences as well, because the audience that is listening to us digitally also grew and changed over the last couple of years as well. One of the things that I always kept telling you all, that in the last 2 years, even though I'm on one side of late 20s last couple of years, the transition from teaching in a classroom for me to now teach through Zoom or Microsoft Teams, it was a struggle for me. And we know that there were teachers across the board, different boards, state boards, central boards, different ages, teaching different types of students coming from different backgrounds. And that transition may not have been smooth. I also told you all that now that I have to go back into the classroom, there are certain positives of teaching at a distance and teaching en masse, which then cannot be replicated in a classroom. Assignments have to shift back, so on and so forth. So, I mean, at least in my experience, at least as an educator, there was something to take and there was something to reject as we concluded. But specifically in your projects, it was really interesting to hear what the challenges already were that you have faced, and also what was the lasting flavor of the pandemic-induced change in audiences that you may or may not have had to deal with. I think that was very interesting. And I think I would request all of you all to talk about the start time of your project for context for the audience, the time it started. So, anybody, please.
Yeah, so our project, I think, began sometime around August 2020. And it was largely motivated by the pandemic. So just before that, Anirudh had gone to Goa. He had visited the museum's collection and he really loved it. And then he called me up and told me about the museum. He said, the next time you go, you should really go and check out the museum. And I mean, of course, he knows that I'm very passionate about Christianity and Christian cultures in India. And then, he came across the application for the project. And then he called me up and he was like, do you want to work on this? And then I said, I'm not from an art history background. I'm not from a history background. I'm just a little Christian boy from Mangalore, right, who knows these objects and knows a little bit of my religion. And he said, that's all that I need. I need someone who knows these objects, right? And he comes from a history background and a podcasting background as well. So with no disrespect to all of the horrible things that happened during the pandemic was a motivator for us. Having time on our hands between our work, which was limited in various ways by the pandemic, this became something that we could do, right? And because a lot of the data was made available to us by MOCA digitally, we were also able to, not have to break COVID-appropriate behavior, right? We were able to work from home, get into conversation with them, share scripts with them, and eventually Suman, who is our previous project coordinator, one day she called me up and she said, Kevin, it doesn't work like this. At some point, you have to go to the museum, right? And then I actually went to the museum, and because I hadn't seen it, but Anirudh had. And I mean, that changed the shape of our project in many ways, right? Me visiting the actual space of the museum. And as I mentioned in my initial presentation, the pandemic also shapes the audience for podcasts. It has created an unquenchable thirst, right? A huge shift in what people want to consume and how they want to consume it. So I don't necessarily see the pandemic as a challenge. In some ways, it was an enabler for my project.
That in and of itself is a refreshingly different answer. Yeah, please, considering our attention spans are anyway 8 seconds.
So my project started in late March 2022. So I think that's a post-pandemic era.
If we can call it post.
Yeah,
sure.
If you can call it post.
Post-lockdown.
Post-lockdown, yeah.
Post-lockdown, and that's a better.
So in my initial proposal, I was also going to look at, it was going to work between science, history and art. But, after visiting the museum space, we realized that there were lesser people visiting the museum than before. There was an understandable public fear of choosing a medicine museum versus a conventional art museum, when people were mostly flocking off to theaters or other places, hotels. So, there was an additional thing that in St. John's, there was no clearance for children to enter the space yet. So what do we do now? So my project changed from being centered around science to market the museum itself and to make it visible through my film. And that's why now I'm making a film on Major General S.L. Bhatia. So that's how pandemic affected my film.
Of course.
True, and building on from that, children are important here because for the longest time, a lot of the visitors were from schools who organized these trips. And once the pandemic came in, as she said, schools became virtual. Field trips became non-existent. And bringing a whole bunch of children to a museum in a hospital, which is a primary healthcare center, was something that most schools were not really willing and open to do. So the footfall, I think all of these things Radhika will explain in the next part of next panel, so I won't go into that. So that redefined the need for the museum itself to engage with different audiences. And as Kevin also said, it brought out the audience needed for podcasts, because you can multitask with it. You can, you know, drive, you can walk, you can do your chores while listening to things, and that entire digital audience also was created by the pandemic. And on top of that, just as an archaeologist, I'm traveling everywhere, and I was in the middle of my PhD then, so that was the longest time I was grounded in any place. So I needed to do something to keep myself active, and we started the podcast, and that grew into what this became. So I think that's how this pandemic kind of geared this entire project.
I think that's a good way to position the pandemic, as a gear in all of our different journeys, of course. Okay, as a panel, again, to talk about reimagined access and outreach has to also acknowledge the severe privilege within the room itself. And when we talk about privilege, and this is an exercise I do in my classroom as well, that if you're understanding English, if you're understanding what I'm saying, and just understand, I'm not talking about whether you can speak, if you can understand what I'm saying, and if you have a collegiate degree, any degree, if you have an internet-enabled phone. So we're already in the top 6%, close to top 7% of India in this room.
Correct.
And within that space of privilege is where we're talking about access and outreach. So this is also a self-reflective conversation that we had, which was more incredibly painful to have, because the projects that all of us, and all of them especially, are working on are for the public en masse. They want the public, and the public is not a monolith, which is something, you know, we all kind of discussed a lot, you know, who is this public, what is this public, what are our languages of communication within our projects. And then they introduced me to the kind of translations that would be part of their projects. And this is also a big nod, and our learning from yesterday to today as well, of course, to the ISL team, but also to the fact that for Keshav sir's presentation yesterday, there was a live translation, so which is also something that we noticed about, you know, quote-unquote true accessibility. What does that look like? And we also talked a lot, actually, about is it even possible, or what are the degrees to which we can make it possible, considering we reimagine all of access and outreach, which is the penchant of our panel, and the fact that making tangible experiences with tangible objects, intangible experiences which may or may not happen with tangible objects, and that's kind of, you know, the prime thrust of where we are. So any of you?
So I'd begin with MOCA. One of the things the first thing actually that caught my attention when I walked into MOCA was that it was accessible to people who aren't able to walk. It was ramp enabled, and it has a chair lift in this museum space, which I was personally very, very impressed by. And I'm sure Natasha will talk more about the chairlift later on. Another question when it came to accessibility, like Shaleen rightly pointed out, language became something that we needed to talk about, because we were primarily envisioning the podcast in English. And the language of Goa is Konkani. So it would be unfair to talk about the history of Goa and Goa's Christian art without making a reference to Konkani itself. And then came a very big boogeyman, who's Konkani, right? Because, for example, I'm not from Goa, and the dialect of Konkani I speak is very different from the dialect spoken in Goa, right? And similarly, within Goa, there is a whole Pandora's box of this conflict, right? What is the standard version? What is the standard script? And all of those kind of issues. And of course, again, through Natasha, we managed to contact a translator who worked on 2 of our scripts. Even though it is a token representation, 2 out of 25 scripts will be in Konkani. But it is an effort to make our work accessible to local communities. The next question was about faith. How do you make faith accessible, right? Because this is something that we kind of encountered a lot while working, or we still encounter while working on scripts, right? From an insider's perspective, from an outsider's perspective, how do you translate these ideas, right, to make it accessible? Because it's not just, these objects are not just objects, right? They're objects of faith. They're articulations of ideas, of devotion, all of those things. So that also became a huge problem. And I just want to reference back to that image I showed you of St. Andrew's Church and the soundscape that we recorded there. When we were doing that, there was this whole conversation that kind of erupted in my head, where I was saying, is it ethical for us to use music from St. Andrew's? Not because we didn't have permission, we had permission. But in my head, I was, fighting over this idea that St. Andrew's is a Protestant church. And the music of the Protestant community is very different from the music of the Catholic community, right? The kind of instruments, St. Andrew's uses a pipe organ, the Catholic church normally uses pedal organs, right? And the hymn itself, which is the primary soundscape in our podcast, O Sacred Head, So Wounded, is a post-Reformation hymn, right? But these were battles I was fighting in my head, right? And when I told Anirudh about it, he looked at me and he said, do you really think anyone will notice and anyone will have these questions?
Ouch.
Right? Because, I mean, again, right, it's a question of faith. What do I know about this community and the way in which this community practices? And the last question that came to my mind, and it's something that I, again, spoken with Natasha and with the panel here, is it's not just about the money that I pay when I go to a museum. It's about having the cultural capital to imagine museums as part of my entertainment.
Excellently said.
When I travel to a city, do I feel comfortable enough to think that I belong or I deserve to go to a museum? For a lot of people, museums are like very far out on the list of the things they want to do in a city for various reasons. Maybe it's boring or whatever it is, right? But it's not just people like us. It's people who don't necessarily speak languages like us, who don't look the way we look, who belong to different socioeconomic groups. Would they necessarily think of museums as entertainment or as places to see, right? And I really don't know how we can reimagine museum spaces to make it accessible to everyone. If it is ever possible at all, I don't know.
I think that's, I mean, you left us with a great question, and panels should also leave us with questions as many answers as possible. We don't know. We don't know, right? Yeah. What about you?
For me, accessibility in film is seen through subtitles and language. And animation is such a powerful tool, it does not require any language. Maybe it's just accompanied with sound and music. And this was my pitch, and even though I tried to stick to this, it was very obvious that I needed a voiceover and a narration to tell the story of S.L. Bhatia. So now my film will be bilingual and it will be available in English and Kannada. And the other thing that happened as a byproduct of shooting these objects in high-resolution images is that now I've generated this digital collection which can be uploaded on the museum's website, and the collection will be accessible through the website. So that's just a byproduct of what happened while shooting for the stop-motion animation. So that's quite interesting.
True, and I think building on that, the museum itself, our project tries to engage two kinds of audiences, both coming physically to the space and those who can engage with it from afar. So with regards to the physical audiences, one, considering it's a small museum in a larger institution where there are other priorities like healthcare and medicine, the kind of resources that are given to the museum is very limited. So say accessing things like, say he said ramps and stuff like that, that don't exist in this space. So that already alienating a large non-abled population from accessing this space. Plus, considering, that's one of the reasons why we wanted these audio guides, so that even one small minority of the non-abled could probably access the museum on their own. Even if they can't, and plus digital audiences if they can't enter the space physically. And plus language is always another issue, both of them brought it up. when we're having these unscripted dialogues, automatically based on the kind of resources we had, it defaults into English. And so translating them takes a lot of skills that currently we don't have. So we need to do that. And which language, I think, as you said. So medicine or history of medicine is a universal how do you say, subject.
Absolutely.
And so especially in this post-pandemic world where we have a lot of these alternate truths out there when it comes to medicine, which we see, we need to get this access to the history of medicine. Why certain medicines, why certain practices, why are they in place? So that access and that outreach that we as science communicators need to do is paramount, and that's something we are trying to get through this. So hopefully we'll try and do stuff. And plus, as Meera also said, there's a lot of archives in this museum that just are in this museum and the library. So translating them, making them more active, making them more accessible to people who can't visit the space also became a priority, and hopefully is something we can continue to build on. And once we have this, how do you say, conversations out there, people are, as a proponent of open source, open access technology, it's there. You guys can take it and translate into whatever you want, share it how you want. It's free for the world to do as they want.
Yeah, because one important aspect is everything you all are creating is free of cost.
Exactly.
And that's
it's not free of cost, but we offset the cost through, say, things like the IFA project.
Fair.
Stuff like that.
Free to use.
Yeah, free to use.
Free to use.
Free to use. Yeah.
I think this is also a huge nod to the ecosystem here in and of itself, because we can have such a detailed conversation about all these aspects, knowing that there is an audience that we don't have to convert. We're just preaching to the converted. Everybody's understanding, hopefully, what we're saying. But the audience is a huge part of all of our ecosystems. And in ecosystem, you know, it's also from the IFA, which is the reason that we're here, to all organizations that help fund in so many ways, not just the projects that you all are involved in, but the projects at large. I'm a Gujarati, so I have to think about money. Where is it coming from?
Yes.
How are we getting it? I think the other crucial aspect also is stakeholdership in the form of your audience also is not a monolith. So, you know, we've all spoken about different ages of the audiences, you know, that you all are dealing with. We also have so many ways in which there's an invisible set of support staff without whom nothing actually ever happens. So beyond the curator, there is everybody. There are the engineers on ground, there's the electrician, there's the carpenter, there's so many things that lead up to the exhibitions in and of itself that you all are interacting with. So there's that daily ecosystem, and then there's the ecosystem at large. So if we were to, you know, create a map, what would that kind of look like? And maybe let me just change the order and start with Akash this time.
Okay.
So he doesn't get to build up, but he has to say.
Oh well, laying the groundwork, huh? As an archaeologist, I need to dig to the foundations, not lay them. So there's a large active web of stakeholders, as you said, from funding agencies to the audiences to the people who generated both the resources at the museum and the general scientific resources that we've accessed. And plus, one of the things we try to do is include more, how do you say, nodes into the network by trying to translate to give access to, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have access, right? To make more nodes within amongst the stakeholders. And through that, you know, the larger the web is, the more encompassing it is, the better it is, because it's a collective journey that we are going on as a species, evolutionarily speaking. So I think, yeah.
Meera, go for it. Kevin, any?
I think in film, the other stakeholders that we have that are absolutely necessary for it to, you know, produce and release are the sound designers, musicians, translator, and voiceover artist. Other than that, it's the audience, which includes the museum goers, maybe researchers who can go through our research and build something on it. the local community that depends on the museum for their entertainment and education. So, you know, maybe hold workshops for them, like we did the first workshop that we held. And lastly, probably visual artists in the city who can now see how archival material can be utilized to tell stories.
Absolutely. Kevin?
With regards to the stakeholders, I mean, of course, there are the traditional stakeholders in the museum, the audience, the curatorial staff, the support staff, and the governing councils. But for me, the question that really haunted me, and I've been asking a lot of people while preparing for this particular presentation, is when we make a podcast and we transport the museum space orally to the oral form, how does this affect the museum? We're still working with this assumption that this will direct footfall towards the museum. But in an age where already we are not necessarily a museum-going culture, museums are not very high up on our list of priorities, by digitizing the museum space and making it available orally, are we threatening museum culture? This is something that that's a question I'm not able to reconcile with myself.
Every conversation we heard that.
Yeah, no, but I have heard some very positive responses. I have heard people say that now that I've heard this, I may want to visit the museum.
Exactly.
I may actually want to go. I spoke about this to a student of mine when I was on my way to Calcutta, and he said, I'm tired of being at home. I will never take physical spaces for granted. I want to go. So if I hear about something and that's interesting enough for me to, to bite the bait, I will go to the museum space. So for me, that was hopeful.
Amazing.
But yeah, I still have that doubt, right? If I have heard everything about the museum, will I still, I mean, I think of myself, if I've heard everything about the museum, will I still make the journey to actually visit the museum space? And how will that affect the museum and its stakeholders? Yeah.
It's very self-aware, very deeply self-aware point, and I'm sure in the next panel some part of that would be addressed. I think we have our very last, which we wanted to have fun with, which is that we had a wish list, no holds barred. You know, anything that we could wish for in the context of our present pain points, like what would that look like? With no boundary, and just, you know, you could really go in all directions. And, you know, we were discussing this even yesterday. If you saw all four of us over there hushed for 1 hour, it was that. So at least, I mean, for me, it would be also inspired after yesterday. All speaking engagements. There should be, this is like a very small sort of wish list. There should be like a live translation in the majority language in the space that I'm speaking in.
Correct.
Because I teach a lot in Maharashtra. I know that the students that I'm teaching with also understand Marathi a lot more than they would understand whatever I say in Gujarati or Hindi or even English for that matter. So that would be like a minimum established requirement, and that's just institutionalized everywhere. Like, it's not a thing that we have to find someone for and then, you know, figure out a financial structure for that to be included, that it should just happen. So that's my wish list, which is it's very doable, but so if anyone's listening, yeah. But what about you all?
I think, as you said, I think this was very well encapsulated by Mr. Wagmare when he said, our thoughts are best expressed in our mother tongues.
Exactly.
In whatever language of our brain
Dreaming.
works with. So this throws me back to a conference I attended virtually during the pandemic. It was held in China, and obviously I don't speak any Mandarin. However, they took the effort to, while everybody was speaking in Mandarin, to actively translate it into English for me. So, I mean, with the development of technology, like Meera saying, we can have these accesses, you know, we have already these pocket mics. So I had headphones, put people in one corner, translate into whatever language people wanted to be translated into. So that access and outreach makes it more, and I think with the ISL team here is a wonderful step in that direction. So live translations is something in my wish list.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine too.
And to just immersive experience in various forms. Yes, we are in this wonderful art gallery, so a lot of our senses are being tingled at the same time.
Absolutely.
And so just more such interactive, immersive experiences using, say, augmented reality and all of these things in museum spaces would, speaking purely of museum spaces, would make it a much holistic experience.
Meera, Kevin?
So for me, stories matter to museums, right? So how can museums become better storytellers? So my wish list is just to make it more of a dynamic space, to make it more interactive through storytelling. And it can be oral, like podcasts. It can be visual, like animation, or just GIFs, or graphic novels, or comics. It can be digital, like video games. So just to make it an interactive playground, I think would be really fun. And I would really love to play a video game, which was me.
Video game.
Oh my gosh, putting it on the list.
Next one. Next.
Yes, very true.
Next project. Next to next. We already have the next one.
Yeah, next to next.
Kevin.
Okay, so when we first discussed this as a point of conversation, it was very difficult for me because I'm not a very tech-savvy or tech-friendly person. But I did spend a lot of time thinking about what I would like, what we could do differently, right? And if I could have no bars, there were two things I'd like to do differently, or I would like to see happening in these kind of spaces. The first thing is, I've seen pictures of this somewhere where, there are ruins, and there is a kind of hologram that you can look through, which completes the ruin.
Yes.
Right? So if we could do that in museum spaces, because in the museum space, the object is dehumanized. We just see it in isolation, in bright, impersonal, clinical light. But if there was some way for us to see what this object was in its original home, in the hands of its original users, I think the object would no longer be just an object.
Absolutely.
So if there was some way I could see that. And so that's my first thing on the wish list. And my second thing on the wish list is when I traveled to Dehradun, there is a forestry museum. And in the museum, there is a cross-section of a deodar tree. It's the oldest deodar tree. And the cross-section of the tree is bigger than the screen. All right? And now, I'm wondering, it's such an unremarkable, ordinary plank of wood. But how they have presented it is so beautiful. They've drawn a line from the periphery to the center. And they have marked out different years. So when the tree reached this level, Rani of Jhansi ruled, and then Akbar ruled, or independence happened, whatever it is. And for me, that was so magical because I could locate time. I could locate space, right? A few days back, I collect matchboxes, so one of my uncles reached out to me and asked me if I was still collecting. And then he told me a very interesting story about how when he was a child, he grew up during the Second World War, and there were American soldiers stationed in Mangalore. And this is not something I'd ever heard about. Right? And suddenly the World War, I'm very averse to war narratives, but suddenly the World War became something that I wanted to know more about. Who were these Americans who came to Mangalore? What did they do? Where did they live? I mean, clearly they left an impact on my uncle because he was scavenging around the barracks for matchboxes, right? So I would like to imagine a museum which not just told me stories of objects, but kind of located those objects in relation to me. How does that object connect to my history? How does the history of that, when that object was alive, what was happening in my part of the world and what was happening to my people, right? So if we can connect history, if history is not just a story but a conversation, that would be on my wish list, yeah.
Permanent wish list. Everyone's kind of like, aiming for that. You really thought this through. I really enjoyed what you were saying. So actually, this is what we wanted to end with all of you all as well, because we all have a future wish list. We all have something that hopefully just becomes possible in the time that we're here, in the time that we're observing. We have about more than 10 minutes, and we're happy to kind of take questions or listen to your wish lists and, answer everything in the capacity that we can. And thank you for beyond 8 seconds of attention span.
Yes.
Can I just, is also her? Amel, why don't you, ma'am, can we just hear her first and then you?
Yeah, thank you for very interesting and talented panels. I had a couple of questions because I didn't hear very much about what you are making accessible and how. So I had a couple of, like, 3 short questions. One for the SL Bhatia project coordinators. There is a lot of writing now on the history of medicine, right? And since we're in Kolkata, I'll just take 3 names. Projit Mukherjee on the history of Ayurveda, Rohan Deb Roy on the mosquito and malaria, Shinjini Das on the history of homeopathy, right? So could you give us a sense of what histories of medicine you are engaging with in order to make history of medicine accessible to people? One of the things that we usually do, or historians do, is they recover things from the archive, right? They make things visible. But to what end, right? That is something I'd like to know. For Kevin, one of the interesting things I thought in your presentation was you were bringing the museum into a sacred geography. We know that churches have been places where people have touched idols, murals, to the extent that they have kissed them and have defaced them, right? So, but what you said at the beginning at least was that the museum is an intimate space. So I thought I might ask both the curator and you to say a little more about what it almost seems in your presentation that this could be a community museum also. What is a museum like MoCA? What does it intend to do, right? How does it intend to impact its audience, right? So I think that would be interesting. And for Shaleen, I wanted to ask a little bit, because it was such a fantastic presentation, about what is at stake when we make short videos. So the Shashi Tharoor line has been that colonized societies ought to have their art or objects repatriated. What is often missing in this very quick polemic is that a lot of this looting was facilitated by elites in colonized spaces, right? And that is a very, that is a more difficult conversation, because the descendants of those colonized elites have benefited from globalization, etc., and have continued to dominate societies. And we have now 50 years of scholarship on the histories of these elites. But I'm not sure if that comes through, because it's a very neat polemic to say, yes, the empire looted. But that's also rather incomplete, right? How does it reflect 50 years of scholarship that has troubled this idea of, and created the notion of hybrid selves, reading the archive differently, etc. So I thought I'd ask these 3 questions. Thanks.
So we'll start off with your first couple of questions with regards to what histories of medicine. So until recently, the SL Bhatia Museum, located within a hospital space such as St. John's, their history of medicine was very Eurocentric. So through our projects and also ongoing activities that the museum is doing, we are trying to bring in these decolonized notions of medicine. So be it Ayurveda, be it traditional folk medicine, be it deities of disease, be it homeopathy. We are trying to situate them in these contexts, in this space. So this is something that is ongoing, and you asked to what end. We don't see it as an end, but a means towards where it could go. We're still in a phase where we're still working towards it. So we are open to all possibilities and potential.
Thank you, Amel, for that question. I think that's a very important question. What do museums like MoCA intend to do? I can't answer in an official capacity because I'm not part of MoCA. But what I imagine a museum like MoCA does is it draws for me, what it did for me, and perhaps what I think it does for a lot of people, is it draws our attention back to these objects which you rightly pointed out are a part of our daily life. Right? As a Christian coming from a Christian community, Christian home, Christian churches, we see these objects and they're a part of our everyday living. We, like you said, we touch some of them, we interact with some of them, but we don't think of them as objects of art. We don't think of them as cultural production. We think of them as a means to an end, ideally a means to an end, right? Which creates this huge problem within Indian Christianity, where a large number of objects are cruelly restored, which essentially means painting over them in narrow lac, right? They are replaced by plaster of Paris, right? So one day, someone comes to church, throws 50,000 at the priest. The next day, some statues are missing and they're replaced with plaster of Paris, right? Where do these statues go? Where do these church bells go? Where do the chalices go? We still don't have answers. Communities don't have answers for these questions, right? So for me personally, what the Museum of Christian Art did, and I must mention that the Museum of Christian Art is Asia's first museum dedicated to Christian art. What the Museum of Christian Art did, and what I hope it does for a lot of people, is also turn back to our communities, to our homes, where we look at these objects and realize that they don't just have devotional value. They also have aesthetic value, they also have historical value, they also have cultural value. Right? I hope that kind of it addresses some of the thoughts you're having on this space.
Hello, madam.
Thank you.
Hello.
Sorry, sir. I'm addressing Amel, and then we have ma'am, and then sir, and then we'll come back to you. Sorry for the patience. Amel, thank you for highlighting two very crucial aspects, that when history is condensed, especially for a 1-minuter, there is a lot that gets lost. Echoing what you said, those were my problems as a researcher with what we were doing. And I was one of 100 people, and that was my problem as well, that when we take 300 years of narrative and want to make an awareness bucket out of it, there are different ways in which we do it. There's a 15 to 20 minute podcast of the same instance that we want to talk about. There's a 1-minute small short film, an immersive film, and then there's a 1-hour podcast. So we released all of them. For the purpose of this conversation and this setting, I only showed the quickest one because I also had to rest my case after a point that this was a very mass appeal project. Unfortunately, what happens with mass appeal TEDxy conversations, it leaves a lot of the nuance and a lot of the deeper parts of research out. And there is no successful way to condense that into a minute-long, visually exposed film with 1 minute of narrative coming in from someone who spent probably 12, 13 years, and we've heard like 3 hours of podcast from them, and then squeezed 1 hour, and then 15 minutes, and then I have come on to that 1 minute. So I agree that there is a part of that does get left out, and in this particular format, that is very, very difficult to bring in, and even I had to kind of rest it after that point myself. The other is the intent. What I have understood, what Vice wanted to do, it was not to educate, I understand that itself is patronizing, the colonies, former colonies. It was nothing to do with the descendants of all of the beneficiaries of this act within the former colonies. It was to do with the alarming rate of British children and British adults either having a lacuna within their historical past or having misplaced pride. The intent of Vice was that, because we knew that the intention was more the British viewing and listening audience that has a huge gap in their curriculum about South Asian history and African history, and then I can keep going on and on. The intent was for that audience, for what it was intended for. Unfortunately, I must say that did work without getting into nuance. And for nuance, there are occasions of different conferences and different spaces in which the researchers of those projects, they're the ones that speak more in depth, and that is where I've heard the contributors from different countries address that. So that is all I can say in that regard. I hope that addresses some part of what you said. Ma'am, you, Shudha, you, and then sir, we'll come back to you. Please.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to Kevin about a work of art, a beautiful piece that you showed in the church. Perhaps it's the Virgin Mary, but it is, built like a Hindu goddess standing on a lotus pedestal. So were the artists or the masons who built that at a later period who syncretized their art form with the Christian art, which is traditional, because it was quite, it stood out in the church niche. And I also wanted to say that I have visited Goa way back in 1949, when it probably was never like this. And I had the opportunity of visiting St. Francis Xavier's exposed coffin in a small glass case. All that, certain topics that you do took me back into a past that I remembered Goa with. Can you explain about this art form, Christianity?
Thank you so much for this question. Particularly, you mentioning that you've been through the exposition of St. Francis Xavier. I mean, when Goa was not Goa, right? It was the Portuguese, yeah, exactly. So I can't even imagine what Goa must have looked like at that time. But coming to that particular object that's
left out, and in this particular format, that is very, very difficult to bring in. And even I had to kind of rest it after that point myself. The other is the intent. What I have understood, what Vice wanted to do, it was not to educate, I understand that itself is patronizing, the colonies, former colonies. It was nothing to do with the descendants of all of the beneficiaries of this act within the former colonies. It was to do with the alarming rate of British children and British adults either having a lacuna within their historical past or having misplaced pride. The intent of Vice was that, because we knew that the intention was more the British viewing and listening audience that has a huge gap in their curriculum about South Asian history and African history, and I can keep going on and on. The intent was for that audience, for what it was intended for. Unfortunately, I must say that that did work without getting into nuance. And for nuance, there are occasions of different conferences and different spaces in which the researchers of those projects, they're the ones that speak more in depth, and that is where I've heard the contributors from different countries address that. So that is all I can say in that regard. I hope that addresses some part of what you said. Ma'am, you, Shudha, you, and then sir, we'll come back to you. Please.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to Kevin about a work of art, a beautiful piece that you showed in the church. Perhaps it's the Virgin Mary, but it is, built like a Hindu goddess standing on a lotus pedestal. So were the artists or the masons who built that at a later period who syncretized their art form with the Christian art, which is traditional, because it was quite, it stood out in the church niche. And I also wanted to say that I have visited Goa way back in 1949, when it probably was never like this. And I had the opportunity of visiting St. Francis Xavier's exposed coffin in a small glass case. All that, certain topics that you do took me back into a past that I remembered Goa with. Can you explain about this art form, Christianity?
Thank you so much for this question. Particularly, you mentioning that you've been through the exposition of St. Francis Xavier. I mean, when Goa was not Goa, right? It was the Portuguese, yeah, exactly. So I can't even imagine what Goa must have looked like at that time. But coming to that particular object, that's a very, very fascinating object. It's an object that catches a lot of people's attention. I want to tell you a lot of stories about that particular object. There's an entire episode dedicated to it in the podcast. But the one thing that I will mention, just to kind of perhaps answer some of the questions you have, is that this object has, for a lack of a better word, a miraculous origin story. So the person who donated the object to the museum found the object. Yeah, so he was a priest in a seminary, and he found the object in his room. And he went to the director, to the rector. No one was able to explain where the object came from. But we definitely see a lot of parallels between this particular object and the work of Raja Ravi Verma. And in the episode of our podcast, we talk about, this idea of a new Indian nationalism that is, disseminated through Raja Ravi Verma's work, and how perhaps that inspired whoever it is who made this particular image, because it draws heavily on a Marian tradition of iconography. So in Mario's presentation yesterday, he spoke about the crescent moon, the Immaculate Conception standing on the crescent moon. ceremony. So that is also there in this particular image. We're very sure it is an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. There is the dove above her as well. So there's no question about whether it is an image of Mother Mary or not. But as to who made it, where was it made, and when exactly it was made, even the donor was unable to provide that information to us. We actually have an interview with him. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. Shudha, may we hear from you, please?
Thank you all for your very rigorous presentation. Yeah. I have a question for Kevin, because I was quite fascinated by the narrative that you proposed. Museums are places for stability and harmonization, but they're also spaces for thinking about ruptures and instabilities. And in the case of Christian art in Goa, there is a problem that always gets slightly moved to the side, which is that many of the patrons of these objects were actually also suppressed, and there's a very little known history of the persecution of Christian orders by the Portuguese state. So let's say in the 1570s the Jesuits are expelled, and they don't come back until the late 19th century. 1830, all the Christian orders are expelled. And much of this, like the Jesuits were very heavily involved in the production of cultural objects because they actually valued the production of culture. So how does one, and this is a completely different discussion from, let's say, the conflicts between the Christian churches and non-Christian communities. We're talking about conflicts within the Christian ecumen, where the Portuguese state decides it has to suppress certain things. So in your presentation in the museum, or in your future podcast, would you be able to consider thinking about these disruptions?
I think that's a very, very important interruption that a very important moment of history you're drawing our attention to. I think, and I want to answer it in a slightly different way. There is this dominant narrative that in Indian Christianity or in Indian Christian art, or let's say the art and architecture of Goa, is a happy accident, right? It's constantly seen as a synthesis. Right? So because there is some Western influence and some Indian influence, and because they are so close to each other, some spillage happens. But it's a lot more conscious than that. Right? Some of these liturgical objects which are not there in this presentation, for example, have images of a naga, a snake. And there is absolutely no way a staunch Orthodox Christian would allow an image of a snake on the altar. It wouldn't be allowed. It wouldn't happen. Right? But the fact that this object has been used, it has been kept on altars, has been used, and mercifully survived all of the other things that could have happened to the object, and now has made its way to the Museum of Christian Art, tells us that there was, if not an overt dikkat from the government, there was an active movement, at least among the clergy, to allow these objects in, to allow some kind of conversation between the Christian visual vocabulary and the vocabulary of the artisans, right? So I don't know if we will ever be able to access this conversation, because like I said, with a lot of the objects, we don't know where they are made. Were they made by Goan artisans, or were they brought in from other places? Who designed the objects? Were the designs given to the artisans, or were they just told this is what it should look like? Because, for example, in one of the images, there's the pelican monstrance, right? Now, in the catalogue, it is documented as the pelican monstrance. I've looked at that image 100 times, and it never struck me that it looks nothing like a pelican. It's actually more like a peacock, because an Indian artisan would probably have never seen a pelican. And the pelican image comes from a rich tradition of Christian theology, the idea that the pelican rips its own breast to feed its young, right? But an Indian artisan couldn't imagine that. And there's such a large 4 feet high monstrance made, would have been kept on the high altar, had a congregation of Portuguese, Indians and Indo-Portuguese worshipping, and I don't know if they ever questioned why the monstrance doesn't look like a pelican.
Yeah, but my question is slightly different. The production of these objects often took place within the context of the Christian orders.
Right.
like the Jesuits, right? And the Jesuits in particular were very, very much involved in patronage. The history of Goa sees the suppression of the Jesuit order. The Portuguese state expels the Jesuits. And and according to them, the Jesuits there's a conflict within the Catholic Church about the Jesuits being a kind of international entity which conflicts with the
life. Suppose in the past they are thinking about the divine. So the Indian, all Nataraja, Kali and Devi, all these forms are derived by their concept, with their imaginations. So in the scientific age, if we think about the inside of our body and how the medicine works within the body, then it is helpful for the people. So we have to think on that. Thank you.
I mean, you raise a valid point. The thing is, this is something you're also trying to cover, because when you look at the history of medicine as such, be it in ancient India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, healing was always seen twofold. You had the more practical aspect of, taking different herbs or concoctions and things like that, and two, there was a more esoteric belief on medicine, be it with spirits or possession, and always they try to do both. So we have these different letters when it comes to at least Egypt and Mesopotamia that I am familiar with, wherein doctors are, or rather healers are communicating with each other, talking about their experiences, saying that, oh, I kind of did this, I came across this case. So, case files they're sharing. So they're talking about how they're looking at more practical solutions, like you said, how the medicine would work on the body, and two more esoteric concepts about what they gave them, like, sacrifice a lamb or stuff like that to soothe some spirit. So this is something that we see historically, but maybe needs to be translated into the present time. Probably different works will go towards that.
Also, in the interest of time, maybe the last question then from Partho. I've got a nod. So, Partho, please.
Okay, so this is just a comment, just to something that Kevin said. I thought, you said that, the relationship of people to everyday objects of religion, they don't see it as a work of art. Frankly, I don't agree. I mean, if that was true, then simple objects wouldn't be, they would be made functionally. In fact, most objects, including even cooking utensils, forget about religion, are very beautifully, they are not instrumental. And so what the objects you showed had nothing to do with instrumentality. They're already, people think they're works of art. It's just I don't know why we think they're not works of art. I don't think that's the thing. That's why they make them, they make it accessible. So that I would like you to think about that. That's one thing. The other thing I'm very struck by is that you seem to, since you're doing a museum of Christian art doesn't exist only in churches or in Christian homes. I don't come from a Christian home. Our house is full of Christian art, including, fairies, including the baby Jesus. These were porcelain objects which came from Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and we inherited them. They're still there. They're revered, beautiful objects. You should start looking there too, and not just to, because that would just give you the circulation of these images, and some of the things that were coming through, that why does Mary look like Radha or whatever. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that iconography, but maybe it can answer some sort of.
If I can just respond. So in one of my slides, there's a mention of how this collection primarily focuses on Indo-Portuguese Christian art. So it traces Islamic influences, Hindu influences, and Christian influences. So that's how the collection is built. The second thing is that within this collection as well, there are a lot of objects from domestic consumption. So for example, there is a tradition there was a tradition in Portuguese Goa where a small infant Jesus would be given to a bride as part of her dowry. And And I'm guessing it perhaps comes from a Hindu belief or a Hindu tradition where in many parts of South India there is a practice of giving brides dolls when they get married. And this is a kind of passing on of fertility, the idea of fertility from one generation to the other. So there are objects like that as well within the collection of the Museum of Christian Art. Once again, primarily focusing on the Indo-Portuguese art of Goa. Yeah. There are objects of, from outside the church space, which are in the museum space. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody who engaged with us. And despite 8 seconds, I think we did very well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for the last 2 months of engagement. That was just brilliant. Thank you, thank you. And big thanks to Ritvika for always patiently being part of those conversations with us all the time. And thank you, IFA, really. Just made so many cross sections possible. So thank you so much.